Hello and welcome to another episode of Coaching Outdoors. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in and discover a little bit more about coaching outdoors with nature. So our guest today is Nicki Bass, and without further ado, I am going to invite her to introduce herself.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, honestly. So yeah, my name is Nicki. I am a business psychologist and an army veteran. So I transitioned careers and moved across about 7 years ago. And yeah, I help teams and leaders to really develop their adventurous streak and think about how to develop resilience and use team building activities to get outside, experience nature, build connections, and ultimately function and perform better as a team, and as individuals as well. So yeah, and in my personal life, I live on the south coast of the UK by the sea. We recently moved here, which is wonderful. And I spend a lot of time, so if you see me on social media, I spend a lot of time walking dogs or chasing after children. So.
Oh, that's so lovely, Nicki, to have you on. And we just want to say we're really excited about having you on, particularly the adventurous side. We haven't really delved into that load, so we're really keen to get into that, which we will do in the course of the podcast today. But yeah, it's just so lovely to have you on, and we're going to take you right back to we just love asking our guests this favorite question of ours is, what is your earliest memory that you can pull out of the memory banks, and particularly why do you enjoy being outside so much? So sort of two parts to that question.
Yes, I absolutely love this question because it really got me thinking as well. I don't think I'd really thought about it massively. So I was born in South Africa. I was born in Durban. So I guess my earliest memories are we used to basically spend every day out on the beach. My parents loved the beach and we lived just down the road. So I think at some point that was probably imprinted quite heavily on me because I've been drawn back to the beach, back to the water ever since. But yeah, I guess my earliest memories are probably sort of scrambling over the rocks at Umhlanga Rocks or climbing up the steps of the lighthouse. And then, yeah, I guess I love being in outdoors so much. I think I've gone through various iterations. I think I've always gravitated towards it growing up. I was obsessed with skiing. And then after that, snowboarding at university and being in the mountains, and also learned to surf. And I think it also massively influenced my career choice. I was always looking to spend time outdoors, but I think I sort of then reconnected with it when I had my first child. And he, gorgeous boy that he is, didn't like sleeping very much at all. And definitely didn't like sleeping in his bed. The only time he would sleep was sort of attached to me. Eventually I got him to pram, but attached to me on a baby beyond baby carrier. And we were living in Brecon at the time, and I used to spend hours walking along the Brecon Canal with our dog and with him, getting some sort of much needed headspace. And I think it was at that point I really started to value that whenever I started to get claustrophobic or feel like it was too much indoors, just the minute I stepped outside, and then as he grew into a rather crazy toddler, again, the minute we got outside the house, everything would just calm down. So I guess I really it made me realize how important it was to my mental health. And I sort of credit it for keeping me in that space or getting back into that space when I need to. So
the joys of the outdoors beyond the confines of four walls, and
absolutely,
and what happens in actually our awareness around it, and just dialing back into that. And I love this thread of water that seems to be a part of your journey in connection with the outdoors. And yes, I do enjoy seeing your posts on LinkedIn of the beach popping up and going for swims and surfing.
I'm a bit obsessed with it at the moment. So,
and your introduction as well. And it's something really struck me because I'm an army vet as well. And it's not something that I actually use to describe myself. So that really kind of caught my attention there. And yes, we have got that shared experience in the military. Just for the listeners, we went through Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the officer training together back in 2000. We were in separate platoons and our careers had very different trajectories. And it would just be interesting to kind of connect the dots slightly. Clearly, you know, military background and transitioning into the civilian world, then working within the kind of like the organizational coaching space. So, you know, how did you get to where you are now, and any kind of key milestones that you've noticed along the way that were a huge part of this?
Yeah, it's really interesting you brought up that bit about the introduction, because I don't always introduce myself with the army veteran piece as well, depending what I'm doing. But when I was sort of thinking about, you know, my career trajectory, I thought actually it's really important, because I think it very much connects to that point about why the outdoors being a consistent theme throughout all the career choices I've made. And part of the reason I ended up in the army was because basically I'd spent quite a few years post university sort of going off and doing ski seasons and working in summer resorts and doing all sorts and traveling and all that sort of thing. And then I got to the point I thought I really probably should get a job, because I'm not earning a lot cleaning toilets, and maybe I was getting a bit frustrated with that. So I was like, I probably need to think about it. And I remember doing some temping in London in offices, and they were all very lovely people and they were interesting places. I was just like, I am not ready to go indoors. I think I just started feeling like, is this it? Is there another option? And I had no military background, no connection, as anyone who went through Sandhurst can testify. I was just looking for something that allowed me to both use, you know, I suppose use my mental capacity a little bit more, use my brain a bit more, but also allowed me to continue working outdoors, and that being a fundamental part of the work. And that's what drew me towards the army initially. Plus I found out they had a snowboard team, and that sort of was like a selling point. I slightly ignored all the other stuff, but yeah, looking back on it, but you know what, it got me through the door. And I was rushed through at the time because of my age, so I sort of went in really not knowing much about the training or what to expect and everything. So it was a really steep learning curve, and I found initial training really hard, because it was not something in sort of anything I had any connection to or any previous experience of. And the thing that kept me going were those sort of, when I found it really hard, I was like, well, you've done hard things before. You've stood at the top of a mountain where you didn't know how you're going to get to the bottom, absolutely terrified, and somehow you made it down. Or you've been paddling out into the waves, and I don't want to give the impression I'm a great surfer, because I'm really not, but like you always end up going out slightly beyond your ability and going, oh my God, and seeing these waves looming towards you and thinking, I don't know how I'm going to make this. And then somehow you do. And it was those memories, those sort of like that bank of things that I'd done before, that then helped me get through, thinking, well, you've made your way through difficult stuff before, you'll find a way through this. And that's, I guess, the sort of, and I used that throughout my career. I always went back to those places where I knew I'd done hard things, particularly hard physical things, even if I was doing something that was not physical, that was sort of mentally challenging. And I suppose, and I didn't really think about it. And then when I was starting to think about life outside of the army, those thoughts kept coming back in, and I did a master's in occupational psychology, and I became really interested in this idea of that resilience, about this idea that you build a bank of prior difficult experiences. In my case, you know, okay, so standing on top of a mountain, whatever, you may say, well, you know, people have had much more difficult experience, but for me, that's what worked. And I kept coming back to those, and built there, and into those became layered some of the military experiences I had, and this idea that actually if we go through hard things and we find a way through, we begin to just trust our own capacity to navigate those situations and find a path. And I began to wonder if there was something in that. And so that's, I guess, where the psychology bit came in. I was really interested in working with people in the workplace. And then I guess from an adventure point of view, I'd had so many conversations with friends and people my own age who'd sort of slightly disconnected or lost touch with that adventurous part of themselves, that they'd maybe done lots of amazing things in their 20s, or felt they were capable of, they'd maybe gone off bungee jumping in New Zealand, or they'd, tried new physical stuff, but as they got older and as took on more responsibilities, that drifted away. And they no longer had that confidence in themselves. And I guess I was really interested in, I'd sort of managed to maintain that partly because of being in the military and there were opportunities, but also I became more and more aware how important it was to me. So I guess that's what's led me into this, trying to combine the psychological and the sort of the physical aspect now as well in the work that I do.
Wow, that's so good. I love that, Nicki. Gosh, I could start unpacking so much. There's so much in my mind, like racing away with so many great things. I love that you said, I'm not ready to go indoors. And I think a lot of our listeners and viewers would really resonate with them. What I love about that was you used that physicality of that army background, the military, and then, but I'm not ready to be indoors. And then you went off and sought the mental, and you challenged yourself to go and get a master's, and you brought all that together in this beautiful, way of creating this where you are today. And I think that's a really great story that I would encourage everyone to listen to what you've just beautifully articulated, because you've just pulled all that together. And I don't think it matters where you start, your start point. It's about really what you've done, following those passions and what your heart says, and somewhere that all comes together. And here we are today. And I think that's just fabulous and really great. And I could keep going a little bit on that. What I really then wanted to know is, you then somewhere here you brought in this adventurous side. So you have psychology, the physicality, but I love the way you brought adventure, and I'd love you to unpack that a bit more about how you define the adventure within your business, because I think you have a great take on the word adventure and what it could mean to people.
Thank you. So yeah, I think adventure sort of emerged as a theme, if in a way. I mean, I was talking about, when I first started in the business, it was thinking about adventure activities. And I think one of the first things that struck me as I spoke to more people outside of the army, because within the military, you've got lots of people who are used to doing all that stuff all the time. You start to thinking that's, that level is fairly normal. Yeah. And then stepping outside of that, and like I said, just speaking to friends who didn't have that sort of background, it sort of occurred to me that, actually that there are so many different levels within this. And I started to really interrogate, what did I actually mean? Did I mean, you've got to go and throw yourself off a rock, that's the adventurous bit? Or was it about, it was actually a psychological phenomenon, for want of a better word, that was taking place, that actually was about this feeling that you get when you do something. I call it like the icky, sicky pit of your stomach feeling, where you try and make excuses about not wanting to do it.
I love that, yeah.
and just in that moment where you start going, okay, this is the point whether I decide to lean into that feeling or back off. And a lot of the time, I think we back away from it because it scares us, and because I think the signals around it gets sort of mixed up, that it becomes, okay, this must be really dangerous, even if it's not something dangerous, even if it's something in the workplace, for example, giving a talk, or, trying a new project, or whatever it is. It becomes this sort of, there's healthy fear, and don't get me wrong, sometimes we really do need to step away from stuff. But I think when it's just pushing our comfort zones and getting used to that feeling of, okay, so what does it feel if I just sit with this feeling of not feeling discomfort, wanting to run away, wanting to make excuses, but also knowing that the thing on the other side is maybe I want to get to as well. And for me, so adventure or approaching life in a sort of adventurous mindset is about leaning into that discomfort far enough that you feel that you can still manage it, not getting into a panic zone, not getting to the place where actually it is not helping you, but just going, actually, what if I did this thing even though it's scaring me? And where might I get to if I do that? So yeah, I like to call it nibbling at the edges of your comfort zone, because I think it's, if we step too far outside, that's when, you know, and then we don't want to do it again because it's scary and it's horrible. And it's like, actually, you know, and there's times for that, and people have amazing life-changing experiences. So I'm not saying never do it. I'm just saying that when I'm talking about it within the context of the work I do, it's about just testing those seeming fixed walls and just pushing them and seeing if they can go a bit further.
And that's just what makes it more accessible. When I hear you describing it, I think sometimes we can get in this frame that an adventure is something big and it has to be somewhere a long way away, and it has to be for at least a week or a certain amount of time, and I need lots of money to fund it, and I don't have time. It clearly default answer at the moment. And this is really bringing it, you know, into the everyday adventure. It's a mindset as opposed to a thing that it's maybe too aspirational and it's out of reach for so many people. And it would just be taking that side step from, okay, so the psychology, the adventure, coaching. So then from a business perspective, and, you know, we've got a lot of coaches or people who are interested in coaching and expanding their portfolio. You know, ultimately it comes down to a service and offering as a coach, as a consultant, as a mentor, however we're framing it. So for you, how have you then pulled this concept into different offerings that your client base are interested in? And then, I know, maybe, you know, stories, we love stories, some success stories, confidentiality, of course, just as to, okay, so how have people taken this idea and then applied it, and what outcome has there been?
So I guess I've done it in a couple of ways. So I suppose because I've worked with individual clients, so on a sort of a coaching basis, but also individuals within a group, so not sort of part of the same team, and run retreats, for want of a better way in doing that. So, and then on the other hand, that I've got the sort of the corporate, the business model where I work and develop teams and leaders and that side of things. So on the individual basis, and this was really the first idea I had, and I think I thought I could build my entire business on it, and then realized I got 2 small children and that's quite hard. But my idea was to, having spoken particularly to a lot of women who felt that, you know, that part of themselves had lost confidence in that adventurous part of themselves. I had this idea that actually if I could create a space where people could come along and try adventurous activities, and for me, like you said before, like, you know, for me it's always been about around the water in some shape and form. So thinking, okay, I love surfing. I think surfing is such a wonderful metaphor for, you know, there's life itself, but also just when we're trying it and then thinking about how we approach other challenges in our life. So I love the surfing and combining it with coasteering, which is about that sort of immediate sense of fear when you jump off a rock and splash into the water. So I've run retreats for women where we go down to Croyd in North Devon. I partnered with a great friend of mine who runs a surf school down there, Croyd Surf Academy, and basically do a couple of days where we'd spend time doing the activities, but then also time reflecting on those activities. And also prior to doing the activity, doing sort of a bit of theory around sort of thinking about fear and how we manage our fears, thinking about, you know, what resilience really means for us, what are the sort of barriers we're experiencing, and just, I think for a lot of the people who've come, just, you know, what are the reasons that sort of brought them there, because a lot of it is just about having time to themselves to try something new, and so I mean, so many wonderful stories from them, and I mean, one that always comes to the surface when I think about it is going back to this point about what does adventure mean for different people. I had one wonderful woman who came on the course, and she was terrified of heights, and I get that because I really don't like heights that much either, so I totally relate. But luckily, because I'm in charge, I have to jump off the rocks and look like I know what I'm doing. But she came along and she was like, I just don't think I can jump off a rock. You know, I'll come on it, but that bit really scares me. And I was like, that's fine, because everything that we do is designed with an exit strategy. You can slide into the water. You really don't want to come, you can, stay on the side and watch. Everything's viewable from the sort of the cliffs. So, and I was like, well, just come, you've got a life jacket. So if you just want to come in the water, that's completely fine. You just swim along with the rest of us and people jump in and everything's accessible. And she came, and so the first couple of rocks, she sort of slid off or stepped. And the next one, she sort of took a little step into the water from, and she was like, okay, this feels okay. And what's so wonderful about doing the group activities, you just get that energy from the group. It's like there's nobody there going, oh, well, that wasn't very high, or what, she's not very brave, or everyone's just like, oh my God, you can see how terrified people are, you can see where they are, and you're just like, yes, come on, see what you can do, but totally fine if you don't do it. And then she sort of went through just sort of, coming along with the group, and the last one she was like, I really do want to try doing one of these jumps. And so she found, and the rock was, probably the same height as the desk I'm sat at right now, so not very high, but to her, this was a mountain, and she jumped off it, and I've got just managed to capture the photo. Luckily we had a videographer there alongside with her, and she just caught this photo of her having just let all this grin like plastered across her face. And it was like, yes, that's what it's about. That it's just that feeling of, I didn't think I could do it. She hadn't scared herself to the point of feeling sick. She was just going, I didn't think I could do that at all, and look what I've done. And she's taken that forward into her life, sort of trying new things, but also just encourage, a lot of the comments I get just, it's just so quiet out here. It's just, when you're standing on those rocks and you're just surrounded by water and nothing else, just, oh, I need more of this. I need more of the silence. I need more of the encouragement. I need more of the energy and doing things to take me out of my comfort zone, but I just need this quiet as well, and just being in this environment. So I think that sort of encapsulates to me what, I guess that aspect of the work. And I then, when I think about the sort of what I tend to do on a sort of corporate or working with teams, is either very similarly, I'll always partner with, experts in a particular area. So we've taken people to do high ropes, we've taken people to do all sorts of, different types of adventures, or we'll do it around, what look like, obstacle courses, building shelters, that sort of thing. But there's something really magical about seeing how teams, when they're taken outside of their ordinary work or day-to-day life, and they're taken away from their job titles and their structures and their hierarchies, and you just are outdoors in a space with a task to do, and it just simplifies everything. And yeah, you see some real magic happen, I think, in terms of connection. And I think that's the thing that comes through with all of it. It's just, you see people connect in a way they just don't when they're sat in an office or in a conference room.
That's really good. I love that, Nicki. And I mean, like you, your team stuff is evoking. I work with teams like you as well outdoors, and slightly different way, but it's just, I see that connection and just using nature around you to help with that reflection, and just, really getting people, like you said, the lady, all I can hear is water. I mean, it's just, you don't hear that. You're not going to hear that in the office, or, it's amazing. And I, yeah, absolutely love that. I mean, one of the things just to take you back as well is just to, for our listeners, is I really loved your 28-day challenge, where you kind of really, whilst there's all that coasteering and, surfing, I really loved your point here around sort of, you can make it quite manageable, that adventure, that you call it nibbling at your comfort zone. And I'm particularly keen, could you just kind of expand on that a little bit, making it just how accessible these things can be for people?
Yeah, so that 28 days of everyday adventure, I mean, that was in February, I think, it was on our second or third lockdown, I don't remember which. I think I'd had a really miserable January, where the kids had just gone back into homeschooling. I was just like, and it was wet, and it was just miserable, and I felt, you just feel like hammered from all sides. And I think I just had, and I was like, on a second, I work with this stuff, but it's so easy to forget, I think, as well, when you're in it. And then I was like, actually, I've got a tool here that there's a way of changing this. How can I change this? Because I don't want to go through February. There's no school in sight, there's no end in sight to the lockdown currently, but I need to feel different. And so the idea of the everyday adventures really came from, and again, you know, I credit my kids with it, because it was partly about me being really frustrated that I couldn't go on the big adventures, and I was like living vicariously through other people's Instagram posts and going, oh, that part of my life, when am I going to get back to it, and all this. And then I was watching them, and I just, you know, we were just like on a walk or something, and I was just like, oh my God, they're on an adventure. They're on an adventure all the time, because it's new to them. It's all, you know, whatever it is, whether it's noticing, you know, the bugs on the path, or spending hours digging with a stick, or whatever it is, or, you know, and I started thinking, okay, so why can they have an adventure in this space, but somehow I seem to think that's not an option for me. And that, so it was really an experiment. So it was sort of going, okay, well, what happens if I do just start, you know, the minute I step out my door, that starts to become an adventure, because I start looking at things that I don't normally see, that I notice. Even it's like staring at the hedge and looking at bees going in and out, and rather than just walking past it because I'm on my way to get somewhere. And it sort of helps you to see the world in a slightly different way. And I suppose so that's where the accessibility comes from. It is literally the minute you step outside the door, what do you notice that you haven't noticed before? And then building on that was sort of like, oh, well, there's a road like just down the road from me that I've never been down. Like, I have no idea what's down there. I'm assuming it's just houses and streets like most places, but I don't know. And I don't know what. So if I follow that footpath, where will I get to? And I started finding that I was getting like that same buzz of, oh, I wonder what's down there, or, you know, going on a dog walk and just taking a different route, like going off into the woods and then getting to a dead end and going, all right, I'll go back again. So most of the time it didn't really go anywhere, but it's sort of, it was just about starting to look at life in a different way. And I think, you know, so there's the I guess the physical adventure part, but I suppose it was also, so in those 28 types of adventure, what was amazing was, one, it's really quite hard to think of consecutive adventures, 28 days. So I had lots of input from people, you know, from Instagram, or like, you know, people who got in touch and said, you know, I'd go, okay, so my adventure is I'm going to cook something different, because I'm terrible at cooking and I always eat the same stuff and like I just can't be bothered. So, and people would send me, I got so many recipe ideas which were amazing, and I just tried it. I was like, oh look, I can cook something that's not peanut butter on toast. So again, it was just, so I think when thinking about, it's that idea that when you're thinking about adventures, they can be really tiny things. They're just things that either you avoid because you think you're not very good at them, or things you don't do because you just walk past them because you're busy and you're on the way to doing something else. And it's like building in the pause and just going, what can I notice? Or it's the diversion, or it's sort of stepping out of your routine. And I think all of those are so accessible, and they don't mean you have to live in the countryside. You don't have to, you know, have endless time, because I don't have, you know, for me, it's like if I do 5 minutes of something that's just a little bit different, I just get that, oh yeah, life still feels a bit exciting right now. And it's I found it, I guess personally, such a useful tool to be able to go, okay, I can mix things up, I can change how I'm feeling just by trying something a little bit different. And that's why I love it, basically. And so every time I'm feeling like that, I'll try and use that and try it. And sometimes I need a bit of a reminder, but yeah, try and building that in. Yeah.
Oh, and you can't beat peanut butter on toast.
Oh, no, I mean, I still definitely
just like winner. And it's such an important reminder for us as coaches, particularly, you know, this is our work, this is our service, this is our offering, and you know, we need to live it as well. And it can be easy to forget, you know, we're only human beings as well. And I think that reflection piece back to ourselves as coaches, to, you know, everyone who's listening and watching in, is being able to have that mindset. And yeah, it's not always going to be perfect. It's, you know, from day to day, there's going to be highs and lows and lows and highs. Though having it back as a centering point. And it would be interesting just to kind of segue into the science. So we've heard a bit about, you know, your background. of your philosophy, some of the services, and then, you know, having gone off and studied this at master's level, and whether it's something around resilience, nature, motivation, adventure, you know, like the who or the what have been the big influences on your coaching practice?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think it's not really, although I've come across new research, obviously, and I've sort of built on it since I did my original master's sort of thesis for my master's dissertation for my for the occupational psychology. That sort of set the foundation. It was so interesting doing that work because I then went, okay, so I can see where the gaps, I mean, there are gaps. It's not all sort of, yeah, this is perfect, you know, this is all from the same source, but what there are lots of different references in different areas. And I suppose I take my references from as a sort of multidisciplinary way within psychology. So, you know, obviously there's a huge basis within the positive psychology movement around all of this, and, you know, this idea of psychological capital and this idea that you can develop, you know, your growth mindset, and that you can try new things and you can build. I suppose it goes back to this idea I had of sort of building a core of resilience that you can come back to. And I really like this idea, particularly in the resilience literature, around resilience not being something static, that it's not, you're not, you know, there's a lot of it where it gets sort of tied in with grit, or it's like this thing that you're born with and you just have to dig in and keep going. And I suppose the literature I keep coming back to is that, where it's like, okay, so yeah, there might be psychological characteristics that enable your resilience or mean you're more predisposed to find, you know, to reach out for help or whatever it is, thinking about the sort of the big 5 factors. But actually so much of it is around that, what can you develop, what can you build? So I suppose from a resilience point of view, you know, big influences have been Kerry Cooper and Ivan Robertson, particularly within the workplace, and they did a sort of a big meta-analysis looking at workplace training and what have been the sort of successful or late, you know, what the evidence is around the different interventions we do to build resilience in the workplace. And I found that really useful because it also really highlighted, okay, so where are the, you know, where can we claim that actually things do make a difference, and actually where might we be, you know, making some assumptions or pulling things together. So that was sort of really helpful. And also the Crane and Sell did a lot of work around challenge stresses. So this idea that some stresses are really stressful, and a little bit like I was talking about getting outside your panic zone, taking you into a place where actually it's not helpful, you are overly stressed. But this idea that actually we do our best work when there are challenge stresses in our workplace that push us to try new things or take on new work and help us to grow. So I suppose there's a sort of a thread that runs through that. And then where I guess I've then drawn is from sports psychology and performance psychology, particularly Fletcher and Sarkar did a lot of work with Olympic athletes and looked at how sort of previous adverse experiences then improved their performance, which I found really fascinating. Because again, it's this idea that you go back to, you know, when you've had experienced some form of challenge, then that knowledge enables you to work with other challenge in the future, or feel less fazed by it because you go, okay, I've done something that I didn't know I could do, and it sort of pushes your performance. And then I suppose there's a lot more work recently, I suppose, around the sort of more adventurous psychology. Alan Newitt's did a lot of work looking at the outdoors and outdoors interventions and how that links to resilience. So I found that really interesting, particularly when, you know, looking at the dissertation I did. And then more recently, all the wonderful work that's coming out around nature and well-being and blue health, particularly, which I love. So, you know, and this idea of connectedness through nature. And I suppose those are the sort of resources. So I guess I pull in from different places and think about, and I recently read a wonderful, really fascinating book, which was more sort of scientific in terms of medical science, which was, and now I can't remember the name, The Inflamed Mind, Edward Bullmore, which talks about this connection between our mental and our physical health and inflammation in the body, or inflammation, how inflammation in the body basically leads to inflammation in the mind, and that connection, and that sort of sort of dispelling the myth around impermeability between the body and the mind and that connection. I suppose all of my work really is around how our body and our mind, our psychological and physical, interconnects and supports each other, or doesn't at different times. So I mean, there's so much more out there. I don't want to keep going on about it.
No, gosh, that's
just I think it's what I would recommend in people are interested in this sort of space is sort of branching outside, because we tend to get, and I certainly know this from my own experience, you know, you work within a particular, I work in workplace business, occupational psychology. That's where I tend to look at references for workplace psychology, but actually there's so much literature that's not directly related, but gives us that interesting different perspective as well.
Oh, definitely. That's Nicki, that's tremendous. And if you're we'll get, for our listeners, we'll grab some of those quotes and some of those reference points, and we'll pop them onto the website in your podcast, so that our listeners and viewers can grab hold of a few of those if you're interested and you want to dive a bit deeper into reading that, which I'm absolutely certain some of our listeners will. One of the ones I really like the model. You reference it. I think it's in one of your, but is it by Jeffers? And the expanding the comfort zone. It almost segues to your nibbling at the edges, but I really love this model. That is it Sue Jeffers?
Susan Jeffers. Yeah, so she wrote "Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway" back in 1987, which was it was a really massive self-help book at the time. It talks about, you know, literally, you know, how you step out of your comfort zone. But I absolutely love her model because it's so simple, and it's literally the idea that, you know, it's a series of boxes around each other. I use it a lot with clients because it's so visual. It goes, okay, so this is what we're saying. When you push that, there's a new zone of comfort. Push it again, there's another new zone of comfort. And suddenly your comfort zone is so much wider than you thought, than it was initially. Yeah. And then you just grow around that. So I think it's still so relevant, and it's just, yeah, it's a wonderful way of just visualizing that. What am I doing when I'm doing this stuff? What's happening? What's,
absolutely, you know. I love that, and it just articulates that the lady coming off of the small step, maybe sliding down the first step, it doesn't really matter, and then jumping on the second step. And I've seen it myself with abseiling. You know, it's well known in adventure that they will get you to sit, you know, you'll be laid in, but they'll sit you on the edge, and then they'll get you to turn around and lean back. But all the time it's Susan Jeffers just opening up that comfort zone and making it a bit more normal. And that's what I'm sure, you know, the listeners, I would definitely encourage the listeners to just have a look at that model. It's so simple. But as a coaches, we can just ease people into those zones very carefully. And I can see very much how that's exactly what you're doing, and helping people to transfer through that journey. And it's so perfectly great. It takes us on to, we should also let our listeners know that where they can, you also are a podcaster, and you run a podcast called Everyday Adventure Podcast, and I would encourage the listeners to definitely pick it up. I was talking to Nicki, and particularly keen to, I listened to Big Hoof. You interviewed a gentleman called Lewis Hall, and if you could just explain a little bit to the listeners, you know, what that is, what you're pulling in, and what's the aim of that podcast really.
Yeah, so the podcast was another lockdown project. I've been wanting to do it for ages, and I think, again, I'm as guilty as anyone else. It's like, I don't have enough time, it's too hard, I don't know where to start, I know nothing, I'm really untechnical. You know, all of the barriers that I think anyone who starts a podcast sort of comes up with, unless they are technical. But suddenly I found myself locked down with 2 kids, having to homeschool and going, actually, I'd really like some conversations with adults for a start. But also, I think what I'd found was there are so many amazing outdoors podcasts out there, and I listen to lots of them and I love them. But I think it links back to this sense that I had of, you know, having a really sort of busy, crammed, normal day-to-day life that in its essence was fairly ordinary in terms of getting people up, getting them off to school, getting myself dressed occasionally, and sort of, you know, trying to work, trying to keep my fitness going, all of this sort of stuff, and thinking I'd love to do it, you know, a really big adventure at the moment, but I just, you know, there were things that I would have to, you know, I'd have to take a lot of planning. So even if I do, and, you know, occasionally I will go off and I'll go for a week snowboarding on my own and do those sort of things, but they take a huge amount of planning and effort. So whilst they are accessible in the sense that, yes, it's possible, they're not the sort of thing that you can rely on every day. And I can't live my life always, you know, because again, it comes back to that point. I felt like I was only living for those moments, and it makes your life feel sort of more restrictive. And I was like, actually, I really would like to speak to people who sort of have all these challenges, or hear from those sort of people, but who've also found ways to live adventurously. And I suppose that's where the idea of the Everyday Adventure podcast came from, because it was about how do we weave adventure into our ordinary lives. And I started with a couple of friends, people who I knew, you know, were busy working, both of them happen to be mums, but it's not exclusively for parents. You know, there's also, I have all sorts of age groups. Lewis is in his 20s, you know, there's men, women, there's all sorts of people on there but all of them have lots of other things going on, or have found ways to, or have started from a place going, I don't really know how to start this, but I've somehow got there, or I've carved a way of managing all of the other sort of the needs. So there's a whole range of people, and I just thought I'll start with a couple of friends who I've always wanted to have conversations about. One of them had done an ice run across Mongolia, and having not sort of done much running or anything for years, and another had started open water swimming, and was doing, and I think had signed up to do the dark 10k, I think, and both of them I was like, I'm really interested in how you went from not doing those things into doing them, but also how you carved a bit of time for yourself, how you carved, you know, the energy, what inspired you, what motivated you, what kept you going, all of those sort of questions, how the psychological process. And I suppose for me with the podcast, it's all about, goes back to, the thing is the thing, and people have done some really amazing stuff, and obviously that's a great hook and a great story, and I love hearing about it, but I'm also really interested in all the stuff that goes on behind it, the bits where people go, oh god, I don't know why I signed up for this thing. What was I thinking? Or, you know, or it went really wrong and I didn't expect that to happen, or this amazing thing came out of it that I had, because one of the questions I always ask, you know, like, what unexpected benefits? There's a thing you set out to do, there's all this stuff that happens to you along the way, and you might not end up at the thing you set out to do, but what did you get to? And I suppose for me personally, those are the things I find motivating and inspiring, and it could be my next door neighbor, or it could be my mum, or it could be a friend or whoever, but it's like, okay, so that feels sort of possible, but it's also really interesting, that journey of how you sort of keep going. And yeah, so and I love the conversations, they kept me going through COVID and beyond, and I guess inspire me to go out and sort of trying to keep living what I'm talking about. So yeah, so I'm always looking for more interest. This is the thing, is once you start uncovering it, I mean, I'm sure you find it as well, once you start having these conversations, there's always more conversations to have, and more people you go, oh wow, I want to know about how that happens. So yeah.
And there you go, listeners, watchers, there is another series of podcasts for you to dip into and learn from. So we will make sure that we have got the link up on Nicki's episode page. And it is this idea of adventure, and I can always like reflect on myself, and sometimes it's like it's that, I don't know whether it's a military thing around like the adventure training, it's the big thing that you go on, like, oh, adventure training 1 a year, where are we going? And I often find myself like living in the future towards that. It's like a hankering for the future, and then actually, okay, well, what about this present moment piece? You know, at the moment I'm off to Nepal in November, which I'm super excited about on for a running event, and tying in some coaching work as well, within some local communities, which really, really can't wait. And I don't want to just be looking forward to that for the next 6 months. It's like, okay, every day, like, where is that magic, where's the adventure? And I know you referenced the word magic, which you used earlier, and coaching and magic, it often comes through. Though turning the tables, would love to know your plans for the future. and where will you be taking your coaching practice and business next?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always space for big adventures too. That's the other thing I want to say. I think having a lovely balance of both is brilliant. So I guess within the business, very much, I love working with teams of people. I think as more than anything, it's developing more that aspect. The more I experience working with teams outdoors, the more work I've done, and I've started to do some design work around that as well, which I love, sort of actually designing that other people, that facilitators who aren't necessarily from the same background or who haven't necessarily got a lot of experience in delivering stuff outdoors, can take this sort of work and go, okay, this is maybe how I can do it, that it's safe, it's, there's nothing inherently difficult or dangerous, but it's just creating a different feeling in the people who are taking part on it. So I'm really interested in that idea of, how, again, making that sort of feeling or being in outdoor spaces, risking, feeling like you're in a situation that's risky but isn't inherently risky at all. There's no more risky really than being in a conference room, other than you might get a bit wet. How do we, again, sort of democratizing that a little bit, making that more accessible, because I think the more opportunities people have, I find that disconnect between work and outdoors and life really interesting. And I think the more people now that are working from home or working in a hybrid way, that blend has started to happen, but we still tend to treat them very separately. And I think it impacts on our sense of being in nature, our connection with nature. It impacts in the whole sustainability piece as well. So I think I'm really interested in how to make it more accessible, more possible for more people, more teams to experience the benefits of even doing it in a workplace garden, or thinking about how we bring nature into indoor spaces as well. So I suppose that's where I'm really interested in developing further. Like I said, I think there's so much support that's needed right now, particularly as a result of COVID, in terms of supporting teams and helping them to feel connected, given the many different ways in which we're working. I think people are burnt out. I think they are exhausted with everything that they've had to manage in a lot of cases, and work is so busy and so pressured, and we're bombarded constantly. And I think trying to help teams create pockets of spaces, and leaders create pockets of space where they can just start to think and sit and be able to sort of create some boundaries around them is really, really needed. And and I suppose so that's very much where my focus is at the moment.
That's wonderful. That's great, Nicki. I think you're absolutely spot on. Some of the I would reflect some of the work myself in the practice is teams are really, there's a lot of burnout. Teams, hybrid working is causing huge challenges for connection. This word you've used. How do we connect? How do we become together? How do we communicate, collaborate? Lots of stuff coming up in my mind as you were, and you're right, and I loved your thought process. We talked about this with a podcast we had earlier with Gary Pratt, where we talked about how when sometimes we're looking for inspiration, we'll go to the window and look out of the office window. And if we were just to remove that wall and the outdoor, indoors, the indoor, outdoors, your point there. And it's good to hear somebody saying, well, maybe we bring the outdoors indoors, maybe that's, and there's a whole challenge of architecture, and maybe we need to get an architect on here that's doing something. But there's just that lovely, why are we being constrained by these things? And I think you're right. Teams, the dynamics are very complex, and the systems are so infinitesimally interesting. It's incredible. So I wish you the best of luck with all of that. That sounds amazing. We love to go to, as we're sort of coming towards our time, is to see if you were able to recommend some resources, podcasts, literature, books, whatever that might be, that you have found in your time, in your journey, that have been really useful, and you might be able to signpost some of our listeners and watchers, viewers too?
Yeah, definitely. It's quite, I found this quite a challenging question in some ways, because I think I tend to get, for me, inspiration comes from all sorts of weird and wonderful places, and often it's not the places that I would expect. So, you know, I find there are lots of really fantastic business books out there, obviously, which, you know, help with all of these areas, but often the moments where I think, yes, you know, what I love doing is dropping into, say, Radio 4. Radio 4 is my go-to. If I just want to get like a hit of something that I've got no clue about, you know, whether it's I'll turn it on and there'll be like the Life Scientific on, I'll be learning about somebody who's, you know, subject matter expertise is, you know, the life history of an ant or something like that. I find that there are resources in unexpected places, and I think often dropping into something, I guess this feeds back into the bit about the everyday adventures, dropping into something that you wouldn't normally listen, that isn't your area of interest. To me, I find that really, it catches me out, and I find that really powerful, and it reminds me that there's so much more to know. So I think I would really recommend doing that, is just, you know, turning on the radio or picking a program you don't think. And I also find I also find inspiration in reading a lot of fiction, and, you know, literature that's not even necessarily, you know, things that you would think are classics or that sort of thing. Is like keeping, for me, it's the mix of different resources, different, you know, and I'm not thinking, oh, I'm working all the time, but I find that sort of fires me up. And, you know, I mean, in terms of podcasts, I mean, there's so many wonderful outdoors podcasts out there, and many may have already been recommended. I love On the Outside, which is a sort of panel discussion, and it really thinks about some of the more challenging aspects of the outdoors and some of the diversity and the inclusion issues, and brings in lots of voices and really focuses on elevating some of those voices. And I think that's, to me, that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Also, if anybody is interested, even if you're not interested in sort of surfing or skateboarding or any of those sort of things, Looking Sideways is another podcast I love, Matt Barr, because he has some incredibly thoughtful discussions with some people about, often the subjects go far away from the, you know, the thing that the person is known for. And he's had swimmers on there, and Bonnie Sui's come, you know, and he's had Christina Koch, the astronaut who's about to go off, I think, as part of the moon exploration. So yeah, I think dipping into things that are unexpected, read it, like books like The Salt Path, Rain and Wind, just wonderful for just. And recently, actually, I read, there's a former Royal Marine, Nick Goldsmith's written a book called Rewild Your Mind, which is a really accessible, I think I read it and I was like, you know, it's not a sort of heavy read, but what it reminded me was like, oh, okay, yeah, I miss going away and just maybe camping overnight with my kids, or I haven't done that for a while. So things like that, which are sort of, you know, accessible and easy to get into, but also just remind you of, you know, actually the power in doing sort of simple things in nature. So yeah, sorry, I've bombarded you with a whole load of different random stuff there, but
that's brilliant.
I think it was more, when I was thinking of you know, how to answer this question, I was like, it's quite hard to know, because there are so many wonderful things out there. But yeah, I would go for the thing that you don't think you're going to listen to and try it.
And feel free to bombard away. And the answer that you've given is just so expansive, and actually go beyond what could be expected as a resource, which could, you know, feed the intellectual side of your mind. And this is much more creative and opening up possibilities. And we will make sure that all of these are referenced and accessible for our listeners and watchers to dive into. But back to you. how can our listeners and watchers get in touch with you, find out more about your work, and maybe mention your TED Talk, which hasn't been mentioned yet as well, and just feel free to signpost any social media platform that you wish as well.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, I mean, if the idea of everyday adventures is something that captures you, I did a TED Talk back in January of last year, which is about the power of everyday adventures. So please do go and have a watch and see what you think. Otherwise, like I said, there's my podcast, the Everyday Adventure podcast. I've got a website, resiliencework.co.uk. I'm on LinkedIn, Nicki Bass, so please do connect me. I'm always sort of randomly sharing pictures of me jumping in the sea, or unexpectedly. I'd say I tend to share a lot of adventures where I've gone on an adventure that I didn't expect to, or that I suddenly, where I've had to get over myself because I've had all these question marks in my head of shouldn't I do it, and then I've sort of done it anyway, or I haven't in some cases. So yeah, LinkedIn, it's a great place to find me, or I'm on Instagram, Resilience at Work, or my podcast, Everyday Adventure Pods, also on Instagram. I tend to hang out there because I quite like just posting photos of lovely things. Like I'm posting a lot of the roses in my garden at the moment because they're blowing my mind. We've recently moved in, so they're nothing to do with me, but they keep popping up randomly when I've done absolutely nothing to deserve it. And yeah, just finding those little moments in the daytime I quite like sharing. So yeah, find me there too.
I'm hearing you. I discovered a gooseberry bush in my house that I'm renovating in Frome at the moment, and I was like, oh my goodness, how exciting is that? And there was a particularly beautiful red rose as I just did my walk in between meetings earlier today. So no, thank you for sharing all of those, and we will get them up on your webpage for this episode. Wow, what a treat, Nicki. It's been such a pleasure hearing you talk about your work and your ethos, and I hope that everyone who is listening in will be heading out and inviting a little bit of everyday adventure into their day, or they may be out walking, and actually once this podcast is over they can just be mindful and embrace a little bit more adventure into their day. So no, I think definitely a message and food for us all to take into our life, and again into your coaching practice as well. This is a strand of coaching that we've not covered before, and it really goes to show how you can take like a word, a mindset, and really pull that into your coaching practice with individuals, with teams, with wider organizations, and set that apart. And that's within the whole outdoor coaching space. There's so many different avenues that you can really carve out a space for you. So it's a real kind of testament to your business and how that is unique, how that is special. And then for everyone who's listening and watching in, okay, so what about you? What about your business? What about your coaching process? What about your ethos? And where could you go with that? And clearly, if you need inspiration, we've got a whole host of episodes for you to dip into. We are now in series 6, so feel free to journey backwards in time and discover a whole host of other amazing guests who we have been able to have conversations with over the last few years. And it is such an honor to connect with people and learn who are sharing their stories. So Nicki, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, listeners and watchers, for taking time out and listening in today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Nicki.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So if you enjoyed what you've heard, like it, share across your network, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and LinkedIn community page, the Coaching Outdoor Podcast. Thanks so much in advance for your support.